America is one of the world's biggest energy producers. So why can one conflict overseas still hit your gas bill, your groceries, your rates, and your retirement at the same time? Because when oil jumps this hard, the damage does not stay in the oil market. It spreads through everything else. You were told inflation had cooled. You were told the economy was still standing. You were told the worst of the energy panic was behind us. So why does one new geopolitical shock suddenly make it feel like your budget could get hit all over again? That is the real story here. Escalating Middle East tensions and disruption around the Strait of Hormuz sent oil sharply higher. And when oil moves like this, the damage spreads far beyond the gas pump. Major investors and economists have started openly discussing stagflation risk again. That means slower growth with hotter prices at the same time. And that combination is exactly what ordinary households fear most, because it attacks both sides of economic life at once. Costs rise, confidence falls, relief gets delayed. By the end of this video, you'll understand why this is not just a gas price story, why Wall Street is reacting so hard, why the Fed suddenly looks more trapped than people expected, and how one oil shock could spread into groceries, credit cards, mortgage expectations, retirement anxiety, and the entire emotional weather of the U.S. economy. Because the headline is oil, but the real issue is pressure. And once you see how that pressure moves, this stops feeling like random bad luck and starts looking like a system-wide hidden tax. Let's bring this down to real life. Picture a working parent in Phoenix. Long commute, school drop-off, weekend errands. Gas rises fast. That hurts immediately. Now picture a salaried professional in Chicago who barely drives at all. It would be easy to think this is somebody else's problem, but it's not. Because when oil jumps this hard, it doesn't stay trapped inside the gas station. It moves into shipping. It moves into delivery. It moves into airline costs. It moves into business costs. It moves into inflation expectations. And once it gets there, it starts touching almost everything else. That's the part most people miss. The market is not nervous only because crude is high. The market is nervous because crude is high at the exact moment the U.S. economy was already sending mixed signals. Recent service sector data showed mixed signals. Growth slowed, but price pressure heated up. That is exactly the combination that makes both policymakers and households deeply nervous. Slower momentum, hotter costs, that is not a clean growth story. That is the kind of setup that makes investors deeply uncomfortable. So the visible event is geopolitical tension. The visible market move is oil. But the deeper issue is this. A fresh external shock just landed on an economy that was already expensive, already tired, and already psychologically stretched. Now, here's the surface explanation. Conflict disrupts supply. Oil rises. Gas gets more expensive. End of story. But that's not the whole story. Oil is one of those prices that behaves like a pressure signal for the entire economy. If it jumps high enough and stays high long enough, it changes how businesses price, how households spend, how investors think, and how central bankers react. It is not just a commodity, it is a transmission belt. Global financial institutions and the IMF have repeatedly warned that major energy shocks produce slower growth and higher inflation. The Strait of Hormuz carries roughly 20% of the world's traded oil and gas. Even if the conflict cools later, the economic damage starts before any resolution because markets reprice risk immediately, and the cost structure of the real economy begins shifting underneath it. And this is where the story changes. A lot of Americans were hoping for a simple script this year. Inflation cools, rates eventually ease, financing gets less painful, households regain some room. But an oil shock like this attacks that script directly.
Not because one barrel of oil controls the whole economy, but because energy shocks arrive in the worst possible places, in transport, in business inputs, in sentiment, in inflation expectations, and in the future path of interest rates. The price went up, but the deeper problem is what the price starts doing to everything else. Now let's talk about the word that quietly came back into market language, stagflation. That word sounds technical, but the plain English version is simple and ugly. Growth slows down while prices stay hot or get hotter. That is one of the worst combinations for ordinary people because it attacks both confidence and cash flow. You don't just pay more, you pay more while feeling less secure about the economy around you. Investors are once again discussing stagflation risk as oil stays elevated, and traders question whether the Federal Reserve will really have room to cut rates this year. That matters because a lot of financial hope was tied to one idea. Inflation had cooled enough that maybe relief was finally on the way. Lower inflation was supposed to lead to easier rates, cheaper financing, and less pressure on household budgets. But when oil spikes like this, the whole timeline starts to wobble. This is where most people stop too early. They think inflation is only a price story. It's not. Inflation is also a timing story. If you were hoping for lower borrowing costs, if you were hoping the housing market would feel less impossible, if you were hoping credit card pressure would finally ease, then a fresh energy shock not only raises current costs, it delays the moment when the system starts feeling easier again. That is a huge psychological difference. You're not just paying more now, you may be forced to wait longer for relief. Now let's bring the labor market into this, because this is where the story gets even more uncomfortable. Recent employment data often shows the U.S. labor market still holding relatively firm. On the surface, that sounds reassuring. Jobs still look solid. The labor market hasn't cracked. But that is exactly why this moment is more dangerous than it seems. If jobs were collapsing, the story would be simple recession fear. If costs were calling, the story would be simple resilience. Instead, the U.S. is caught in a split-screen economy. One screen says labor is still standing, the other says costs are heating up again. And when those two screens are both true at once, the interpretation gets messy. Because a labor market that still looks resilient can make it harder for the Fed to move quickly toward easier policy if inflation expectations start climbing again. In other words, the part of the economy that still looks okay can reduce the speed of the relief everybody else was hoping for. That is one of those "wait, I never thought about it like that" moments. Strong jobs do not automatically mean safety. In a supply shock, strong jobs can actually make the next move harder. The economy doesn't need to be collapsing for households to feel less secure. It just needs to be vulnerable in the wrong way at the wrong time. Now here's another layer that matters more than people think: supply chains. When global choke points face disruption, supply chain pressure indexes start creeping higher. We're not at pandemic-level nightmare territory, but the direction matters, because this shows it's not only about oil in isolation, it's about how shock spreads through transport, logistics, and the broader movement of goods. That matters because Americans don't buy oil. They buy things that quietly contain oil: delivered food, shipped packages, airline seats, trucked retail goods, construction materials, business services that depend on transport and energy. When supply chain pressure and energy pressure move in the same direction, price pressure becomes easier to spread and harder to dismiss. And this is exactly where the trap becomes visible. People often assume inflation comes in one big, obvious wave, but a lot of inflation works more like dye in water. It starts concentrated, then it spreads, not at once, not always dramatically, but enough to change the color of the whole container. So what happens next if this does not cool quickly? There are three broad paths. Path 1 is the geopolitical situation de-escalates, trade routes normalize, oil retreats, and a lot of this pressure fades before it gets embedded in the broader economy. That's the best case. Markets calm down, and a chunk of the fear unwinds. Path 2 is the tension drags on, energy stays elevated, and businesses begin passing those higher costs through the system. That's when gas becomes groceries, and groceries become broader inflation pressure. Input prices in key service sectors were already rising before this shock had fully worked through, so the system was already sensitive when this hit. Path 3 is the one markets fear most. Oil stays high enough to push inflation expectations up, but growth still slows because households and businesses start pulling back. That's the classic stagflation trap. Not a guaranteed outcome, but now a live possibility. And this is why the reaction is so intense. The problem is not that the worst-case scenario is inevitable. The problem is that the range of bad outcomes just widened. Now let's make this painfully practical. If you are a working household, this kind of oil shock hits you in 4 distinct layers. Layer 1 is obvious. Gas. You feel it right away.
Layer 2 is delayed. Goods and services become more expensive as transport, delivery, and energy input costs work through the system. Layer 3 is financial. If inflation pressure rises again, hopes for easier rates weaken. That touches mortgages, credit cards, auto loans, business borrowing, and stock valuations. Layer 4 is emotional, and this may be the most underrated layer of all. Households start living more defensively. They delay. They hesitate, they hold cash, they cut trips, they pull back from purchases, they stop acting like people who believe the economy is getting easier. That 4th layer is where macroeconomics becomes daily life. A lot of economic pain is not cinematic. It doesn't show up as one giant collapse. It shows up as 1,000 small defensive adjustments. Drive less, spend less, wait longer, hold back, watch every bill. Put off the upgrade, delay the move. That is how an oil shock becomes a drag on the whole economy, not just by raising prices, but by making households cautious. This is also where the old formula breaks. A lot of Americans were raised on a simple economic instinct: work hard, stay responsible, and eventually things stabilize. But what happens when the system keeps finding new ways to delay stability? What happens when inflation cools, but a new shock reopens the wound? What happens when the labor market looks decent, but relief still feels just out of reach? That is the hidden trap. The old formula assumed that once the headline improved, the underlying pressure would gradually ease too. But recent years have taught households something harsher. Sometimes the headline gets better, while the structure underneath stays fragile. And when the structure stays fragile, one new external shock can bring the old fear right back. That is why this story feels so personal. It is not just that oil is high. It is that normal people are being asked, once again, to absorb stress they did not create and cannot control. And once people realize that, the emotional reaction is not just frustration, it's exhaustion. Now let's destroy the safe zone illusion. People often think these stories hit only the poorest households first and hardest. That part is true, but they do not stay there. The most dangerous thing about an oil shock is that it creeps upward. It reaches people who thought they were still okay. The dual-income household with decent salaries but no real margin. The retiree who is not poor but watches every fixed cost more closely than before. The homeowner with a stable job who still has no interest in new borrowing at elevated rates. The younger worker who is employed, careful, responsible, and still feels like building a normal financial life keeps getting delayed. That is how the middle class gets hit by this kind of story, not always through immediate collapse, but through a shrinking sense of safety. You are still standing, but you are standing in a narrower hallway. You are still moving, but with less room to absorb another hit. And that is why these stories spread so effectively through public mood. They do not just describe hardship, they describe erosion. And here's the part almost nobody explains clearly. What makes this kind of shock so powerful is not just the size of the move, it's the layering and the timing. Oil hits direct spending. Oil hits indirect spending. Oil hits inflation expectations. Oil hits rates.
Oil hits markets. Oil hits sentiment. When all of that happens together, households stop experiencing the economy as one clean story. That is why people feel confused. They hear one report say jobs are still decent, another says services are slowing, another says prices are heating back up, another says rate cuts may get delayed. UBS cut its market outlook as higher oil and geopolitical risk clouded the path to Fed relief. The average viewer hears all of that and thinks, which one is the real economy? The answer is uncomfortable. They all are. The economy is not one number. It's a system of pressures arriving through different doors. And when a major energy shock hits, several of those doors open at once. Think of the household budget like a backpack that was already full. Rent or mortgage, insurance, food, debt, utilities, healthcare. Then drop a heavy oil shock into that backpack. The straps may not break immediately, but every step becomes harder. That is the difference between a manageable problem and a system-wide burden. So what should ordinary viewers watch from here? First, oil itself. If crude retreats, a lot of this pressure may fade before it gets embedded. Second, gas prices. That is the most visible bridge between global conflict and household psychology. Third, business input price measures and broader inflation data. If those stay hot, this starts looking less like a scare and more like a renewed inflation cycle. Fourth, the Fed. Not because the Fed controls war or oil, but because oil can change the Fed's room to move. Fifth, the stock market and retirement mood. UBS cut its market outlook as higher oil and geopolitical risk clouded the path to Fed relief. That matters for people who don't trade every day, because market weakness doesn't just hit hedge funds, it hits 401ks, retirement confidence, and the wealth effect that helps shape spending behavior. And sixth, consumer behavior. If households start pulling back more sharply, then the growth side of the stagflation story becomes even more important. This is how you stop getting lost in the noise. You stop treating the story as one headline and start treating it as a chain. Oil, inflation, rates, spending, markets, mood. Those are the links. Now let's talk about what not to do. Do not reduce this to gas alone. If you do, you miss the real danger. Do not assume every oil spike becomes permanent inflation. That is too simple too. Do not jump straight to panic, but do not confuse temporary calm with structural safety either. That middle position is where intelligent viewers need to live. Not panicked, not asleep, alert. Because what this story really exposes is not just energy risk, it exposes how quickly the modern American household can be thrown back into defensive mode. That is why it's so powerful. It is not only a price move, it's an emotional reversal. It changes the emotional weather of the economy. And once the emotional weather changes, spending, borrowing, investing, and risk-taking can all shift more quickly than people expect. Markets price the fear first. Families live the consequences later. That gap is exactly why this channel exists. If you can understand the structure before the consequences fully arrive, you make better decisions with less confusion and less emotional whiplash. So let me leave you with the clearest possible version of the story. Oil did not just go up. A signal went out. That signal said inflation risk is not dead. Rate relief is not guaranteed. The middle class is less insulated than it hoped, and the U.S. economy remains vulnerable to outside shocks that can move straight through daily life. That is why this matters. Not because every oil spike becomes a disaster, not because everyone needs to become an oil expert, but because this is one of those moments that reveals how exposed ordinary life still is. A conflict thousands of miles away can still reach your gas bill, your grocery total, your mortgage outlook, your borrowing costs, your retirement confidence, and your sense of whether the economy is finally calming down. Once you understand that, the story stops feeling random. It becomes structural. And that changes everything. because random events make people feel helpless. Structural understanding makes people feel alert, grounded, and less easy to shock. That doesn't mean control, it means clarity. And clarity is often the first real form of economic protection. If this breakdown helped you, leave a like. Tell me in the comments what you think gets hit first when oil jumps this hard: gas, groceries, rates, retirement, or confidence. And subscribe and turn on notifications if you want more videos that explain what the system is really doing to everyday life. We don't promise miracles here. We help you see the economy more clearly.